Next we have Alex Stewart, who is our last but not least presenter of the day. So adding 14 years of Manitoba civil service experience to his entrepreneurial ventures, Alex has an inside understanding of how policy affects outcomes. So Alex is a National Mirror Committee member of the ISO Technical Committee 207, Subcommittee 7, responsible for the ISO 14064, 65, and 66 family of standards, which govern greenhouse gas measurement, reporting, and verification. Alex is excited to be developing technology to support the carbon offset markets, which he believes is critical intersection of capitalism and environmentalism. A married father of 2 young girls, Alex resides in southern Winnipeg. So thank you for joining us, Alex. Good luck with the presentation.
Thank you very much, and very happy to be here. And so I just to put it in context for everybody, I bring the carbon market perspective on all of our discussions here. And so certainly Dr. Tenuta was the academic expert. And then, the presentation we just had was certainly the on-farm expertise. And now I'm going to want to bring you the carbon market perspective. And so without, any exaggeration, carbon pricing is coming very, very fast. Certainly Canada is targeting $170 a ton CO2 and its equivalents. Europe is targeting 150 euros a ton by 2030. The US administration federally is now seriously considering this. Certainly the customers, consumers, regulators all across the globe are now taking this very, very seriously, acknowledging that attaching a price to something causes people to pay attention to it. And so in this case, we've got the carbon price that is really going to help to sharpen that focus, improve a lot of the adoptions that were talked about in the previous 2 presentations. And what I want to talk about is sort of the specific mechanisms for how those things happen. And so I'm going to be talking to you today about generally what are carbon offsets, how we approach that, and there are a number of different approaches. And then, of course, sort of what the state of the market is currently. So carbon pricing won the Nobel Prize for Economics in 2017. It's certainly been something that's been talked about a great deal longer than that, but it's been recognized now as true and sound economic theory. And so, this is backed up by the idea that, again, sort of, if you put a price on it, people will pay attention to it. And I want to kind of talk about one of the main criticisms about carbon offsets right out of the gate. And that is that they are often drawn in comparison to sort of medieval indulgences. And by that saying, if I pay, a farmer to sequester carbon in their soil, then I can go on polluting for as much as I want. And so while that criticism might be true, the counterpoint to that is that carbon offsets and offsetting generally allow for a much more capital efficient decarbonization than would otherwise be permitted. So let's take, for example, a company like an insurance company. So in Winnipeg, we've got Canada Life. So for Canada Life to decrease their carbon footprint, because mainly that would be made up of natural gas to heat their buildings, they could go out there and spend millions upon millions of dollars to improve the windows in all of the buildings that they own. Some of the buildings that their staff work out of, they don't even own those buildings, so they can't go and change those windows out. But changing windows in a building, office building, is very, very expensive. And so for every, let's say, $1,000 you spend, you achieve a $100 equivalent reduction in pollution. What if we took that $1,000 instead and sent it into the agricultural sector, where we could achieve a $10,000 reduction in offset? So we've leveraged our capital 10 times, as opposed to having to do those internal reductions at about 1/10 of the value. And so there's several orders of magnitude difference in what we can use that capital towards. And that's really the mechanism in the short term to allow us to really accelerate some of these technologies and some of the practices that are already out there. And when many of my young staff get very discouraged around the climate, and they really sort of hangdog around that, I tell them, we've solved that. The smart people in the room have fixed these problems, but they're sitting in laboratories. And we need to bring them from the laboratories or from the small scale, pilot projects to the large scale adoption. And the only way to do that is through that pricing mechanism. We believe that the only way to do that is through that pricing mechanism where we're actually paying and incentivizing those kinds of behavior changes. And so how a carbon offset is supposed to work is that you've got a decarbonization project. So whether that be soil sequestration, or whether that be avoided emissions through any other practices, whether that be changing fuel in a tractor, or looking at, again, the cover crops, intercrops, or looking at sort of the 4R nutrient management practices, whatever it is that you're doing will achieve a reduction in emissions. That reduction in emissions then goes through an auditing process, a third-party auditor, and that gets audited to the ISO standard that was mentioned earlier. And then from there, that audit results in a set of serial numbers, and each serial number represents 1 ton of GHG emission reduction. Then, in this case of this flywheel, Carbon Block gets involved and actually finds the buyers to do that, which then returns the capital back to whoever it is that's actually doing that reduction. So in the case of this conversation, that would be the ag producer. And so that flywheel is really intended to accelerate decarbonization, because now suddenly you're bridging the gap between what is business as usual economic practices and what might otherwise be a greenhouse gas reduction that doesn't quite occur because it doesn't quite make financial sense yet. That's what a carbon offset is directly there to do, because once you get that money flowing in there and the cost of doing those changes comes down and the adoption becomes more widespread, then you're just going to start to accelerate that whole decarbonization process to get us to at least net zero. And as was said earlier, agriculture absolutely has the opportunity to be carbon negative and pass that value down the line, down the supply chain to other people who are prepared to pay for that. And so that value of that carbon neutrality or the negative carbon that you would be able to offer somebody has a real and legitimate value. And so there's 2 different kinds of carbon offsets, generally speaking. There are those within the regulated market, and those examples would be the Alberta TIER system, TIER. There's the Western Climate Initiative, which is Quebec and California. There's RGGI, which is in the northeastern United States, made up mostly of utilities. Europe is actually one of the larger regulated markets. And so those are carbon offsetting systems that are set up because the government says that they will be set up. And then you've got the voluntary markets. And so those voluntary markets are made up of corporations who are buying carbon offsets for ESG purposes. And you might not be familiar with ESG, but it stands for environmental, social, and governance. And so corporations who, you might hear somebody make a claim that, we're going to be carbon neutral by 2050. We're going to be carbon neutral by 2040. Microsoft has actually made the largest decarbonization commitment, which has said, we are going to offset, we're going to abate all of the emissions from our very early inception in the 70s. And so anytime you hear something like that, what those companies are doing is they're pledging to reduce their own emissions where it's economically feasible to do so, and where it's not, they're going to look externally to offset. And so that voluntary market at this point tends to be sort of governed by international greenhouse gas programs. So some of the larger ones that you may have heard of or that you should be at least familiar with would be VERA, or the United Nations has a program that's referred to as Gold Standard. Or in the US, there's an up-and-comer called the American Carbon Registry. And so each of those greenhouse gas programs in the voluntary market serve to facilitate ESG spending by corporations. And so there's an important difference between those two, because in Canada, we don't actually have a fully federal regulated system yet. The feds are looking at what's called the output-based pricing system, the OBPS, but they've been quite quiet in terms of what they're planning, what they're doing. They're currently in the process of writing the protocols or the methodologies. They have released 2 for public comment. That public comment window has closed. So it is our hope that those protocols will be published, as well as sort of what the intent is for the federal government from a cap and trade point of view. And so there really is kind of a hodgepodge across the country from sort of that carbon pricing landscape. Of course, we do have the federal backstop price, which goes up by $10 per year, with the intent, with the current administration at least, of $170 Canadian per ton by 2030. Europe is certainly ahead of us when it comes to carbon pricing. They have actually introduced, as of August of this past year, they have introduced the border tariff adjustment, meaning when you are importing goods into the European market, that they will apply a tax depending on the amount of carbon that went into the product. And so it's to protect their high price carbon market from folks that would otherwise be taking advantage of the low price carbon markets elsewhere in the world. And so when it comes to ag, that's particularly notable because as Canadian agriculture moves towards being more net zero, that is a benefit that can then be used by the food producers who are importing the Canadian ag, the raw materials, to say, look, at the border, here's all of our paperwork, Mr. and Mrs. Customs official. This is in fact a carbon neutral product. It should not attract any of the border tariffs. And so Canada has an opportunity to take advantage of that and increase our market share internationally, and specifically with respect to imports into Europe. And so as we look over time, what's happening for the price of carbon, the graph on the left-hand side shows the supply and the demand of carbon offsets. And so for quite a while, because of the Kyoto Protocol, which was 97, there was an excess number of offsets available. Those have now all been consumed. And so we're entering a period of deficit where there's an insufficient number of carbon offsets to go around. And so naturally, when you have a constrained supply and an increasing demand, you can see the graph on the right that the predictions are for those prices to continue to rise. And so at this point, we're at, I think at last look, we're at about 80 or 90 euros per ton in their futures market. And so which is quite close to this graph's prediction of 110 euros per ton. And so we're certainly seeing the effects that are coming with carbon pricing. You can see it at the pump. And don't get me wrong, I'm not particularly thrilled with the price that I'm paying either, but the intent of carbon pricing being to financially stimulate the adoption of those alternatives, because business as usual is going to get to be too expensive. And we believe that that's going to be a major driver. And so ultimately what we're seeking is economic decarbonization. And when you hear that term, what it means is that we're trying to separate economic growth from carbon emissions. And so the graph that you see right there is as US emissions and GDP. And so those had been traveling in near lockstep for quite some time. So as we increased our GDP, the emissions followed. The US is actually starting to decouple. And I apologize, I don't have a more current graph here, but where a lot of that estimate came from actually was the conversion of coal plants to natural gas plants. Which has been happening very, very fast, given the relatively abundant supply of natural gas in the United States. Coal versus natural gas. The natural gas has about a half the footprint that a coal plant does. And so those thermal plant conversions are actually occurring quite quickly. Canada doesn't have quite as much of that low-hanging fruit to take advantage of, but there is certainly that intention. Now, keep in mind, all of this is in service of that idea of environmentalism. And Environmentalism 1.0 said, if you like the planet, then buy less stuff. And unfortunately, I don't have a choice about the stuff that I buy, really, for my kids or myself or my family. I need shoes, I need coats, I need hats, I need mitts. And so where there might be some opportunity for companies to do a better job of labeling their product about the carbon footprint, really the carbon footprint that I experience as an individual is a direct result of the choices that companies make. And so Environmentalism 2.0 really looks at using financial market innovation and technological innovation to drive carbon out of that continued economic growth. And so we're right at the cusp of sort of seeing that, because the capitalism is really taking to this idea of pricing that and then driving it out of the economy. And so when we look at the different kinds of offsets, there's two main kinds. There's avoided emissions. So if I switched from a gas vehicle to an electric vehicle, I'm no longer polluting as I do my driving around. That would be an example of an avoided emission. Carbon sequestration is where you're actually taking that out of the atmosphere. And so depending on the buyer of the offset, they have started to see some price preference for the sequestration. They tend to attract a higher price. They tend to be in greater demand. We have spoken with the oil and gas sector out of Alberta, and I'm paraphrasing here. This isn't a literal quote, but they said, we recognize that our product is a source of emission. We've recognized that. So we want to pay and be able to prove that we have sequestered carbon. And so that is sort of the virtuous cycle that they are seeking to do as they, of course, move away from the combustion of their product. And so they're not really interested in avoided emissions. And so and I'll talk about what we're doing in the ag sector in a couple of slides here, but there is an important difference to note between avoided emissions versus carbon sequestration. And so what we are doing, Carbon Block, right now in the ag sector is we are focused on both sides of that equation. So we're looking at the 4R nutrient management protocols and guidelines there to avoid emissions associated with fertilizer usage. And so we're currently under contract with the Canadian Seed Growers Association to look at how we can connect some of their practices with the carbon markets, with funding from the carbon markets. And then the other side, which is of course where the Canadian seed growers get involved, is around the use of cover and intercrops. And so the thesis being that we can pay farmers, ag producers, to adopt these practices ahead of time. And there's actually a growing futures market for companies who are seeking to purchase offsets at sort of today's prices for future delivery, knowing that whatever it is right now, I think $50 a ton in Canada, if that's going to $170 a ton in the next 8 years by 2030, being able to lock in today's price for a stable delivery over the next period of time is quite appealing for a lot of companies, those forward-thinking ones. And so we're at a unique opportunity here to really start to push well-meaning corporate ESG investments into the agricultural sector to speed up considerably the adoption of these practices. On the 4R nutrient management side, one of the examples that I've been saying is relates to the stabilized fertilizer product. And so many of these products tend to carry a price premium, and they do see a yield increase. However, if the yield increase doesn't match the cost of increased input costs, then we're not going to see the adoption. What I would like to see is funneling carbon dollars towards that activity such that stabilized fertilizer actually costs less than traditional fertilizer. Because all of a sudden you flipped the script. And why would I ever buy regular old fertilizer? I can buy this stuff cheaper and I get a yield bump, and I'm also doing something good for the planet. So that's really what the power of the carbon markets will bring to agricultural decarbonization. And so how we work at Carbon Block is we take the various inputs, and so we work in certainly in the renewable sector, in the agricultural sector, and in transportation. We run that through our technology, and our technology really functions as the USB port to the blockchain. Without going down the rabbit hole too far, we are building technology to facilitate all of that. And then ultimately we process that data into a carbon offset, and then from there we are looking to store that information onto a blockchain. And so we're sensor agnostic. It doesn't matter what the sensor is that is providing that input. Really what we're concerned about is the moment that that information leaves the physical world and enters the digital world. And so we're entirely focused on developing technology for measurement, verification, and reporting purposes. And so we can generate offsets from certainly increasing the soil organic carbon. This is one of the protocols that the federal government is looking at with their input-based pricing system. They haven't released any details yet. They haven't released the draft for public comment. But the idea being, again, that you can store carbon in the soils, and again, just based on the previous presentation from David, that we can see that other benefits as well in terms of the microbes and whatnot. And so you can use both methodology, modeling, but then of course we're going to back that up with actual measurements of soil organic carbon. And then the other part being, again, the 4R nutrient management practices that you guys would be most familiar with. We're not scientists at Carbon Block. We're financiers. We're a technology company. We connect the money and the technology necessary to allow the adoption of these practices on a per farm basis, because what works for one part of the country or even one individual farm or one individual field is not going to work for another one. And so being able to support the ag producers as they make the best choices for their operation is really what we are seeking to do here. And so we're working with academics, we're working with industry groups to be able to identify those best practices and then ultimately connect the dollars to the adoption of them. And so to close my presentation, the price of carbon is increasing. It is certainly something that you should be well aware of because it will directly impact what you are doing. When we had heard that oil and gas company, or one of the ones that we had talked to, quote the $170 a ton, we laughed that off, because we thought, and we're in the industry, we thought that that would just be too much of a shift too quickly. And they, without hesitation, said, no, that is likely what the future is, and we are planning for that right now. And so you should likely be doing the same thing. At present, the demand for carbon offsets exceeds the supply, so there is a growing need for these, and agriculture is very well positioned to take advantage of this trend. And then, of course, the early adopters into these activities will receive cash payments. For example, if we looked at, say, no-till, no-till earlier on had a tremendous amount of benefits, but because the adoption is so widespread now, that there's really no need to, and actually no ability to provide a financial incentive to that any longer. And so, there's some nuances in terms of the carbon markets that I'm happy to discuss either in a Q&A, or of course you can ask me questions directly. Here's my contact information. So at this point, very happy to have been able to present to you, and I look forward to the questions in our next phase here.